A visit to the Bass Rock, a couple of miles off North Berwick in East Lothian, is always an exciting trip. I went out with these girls from an Edinburgh school on an excursion organised by the Scottish Wildlife Trust as a reward for winning a nature poster competition. The Bass Rock is a huge volcanic plug rising out of the waters of the Firth of Forth with sheer cliffs 300 feet high. They're covered with seabirds of many different kinds. Puffins fly off as the boat approaches. And soon a welcoming party of shags, smaller cousins of the cormorant, are waiting on the rocks for us as we approach the jetty. Half the point of a visit to the Bass Rock is to make a landing and spend some time ashore seeing at close quarters birds which are otherwise very difficult to approach. They're mostly used to visitors, and puffins sit and watch us as we stop for a lunch break at the top of the cliff above the main seabird colony. Here we can look down on guillemots on the ledges and kittiwakes on their nests. There's one sitting on an egg. There's always plenty to see as the birds fly in, bringing in food from the plentiful supplies in the shallow waters of the Forth. A herring gull stands guard over its nest on the top of the cliff. On the grassy top of the Bass Rock, hundreds of pairs of gulls nest, and we can examine this gull's nest with 2 eggs at very close quarters. The owners watch us from nearby, so we move on quickly. It's a beautiful place on a summer's day, with red campion growing in the shelter of St. Baldridge Chapel. There's history here, not only of holy men, but of an island fortress, and that famous story of the Jacobite prisoners who in 1691 overpowered their guards and held the rock for 3 years. But of course, the main point of any visit to the Bass Rock must be to study the colony of gannets. The gannet gets its Latin name, Sula bassana, from the Bass Rock, and here 6,000 pairs of these, the largest British seabird, nest in a kind of seabird city, a crowded colony full of life and noise. And in the upcurrent that blows always at one side or other of the bass, the gannets hang in the wind as though sitting on a cushion of air. The fully grown birds of 4 or 5 years old are pure white with black wingtips. But younger birds still have the dark feathers that they had when they first left the nest. There's an adult. And here, hundreds of them nest only at pecking distance from each other. It's like a town, where we can almost see the streets of seabird houses. There's a young bird, and another one, probably a 2-year-old, now half molted into his white adult plumage. But it's the fully mature gannet of 4 or 5 years old which sits on the nest and lays 1 egg and rears 1 young. They nest on the cliffs and at the top of the cliffs, anywhere where they can find a foothold, but always in close communities. They rear their ugly chicks until they're covered with fluffy white down. And each pair of birds guards fiercely against all comers that square yard which is its nesting territory. You see, the gannet is a fighter. It's quarrelsome and aggressive by nature, and in order that each bird may learn to know its mate so well that it will never peck its mate as it would an enemy, the birds go through a series of elaborate displays. If a bird gets out of its own nesting territory, then it's in trouble from all its neighbours, because any gannet will peck at any other gannet that comes too close. This. And that's why it's so important that the 2 birds of a mated pair should display to each other a great deal, to form a bond, a way of recognizing each other. They come to know each other so well through these displays, offering of feathers and nest material, like this, or bill scissoring, mutual preening, that they cannot attack each other by mistake. These displays are a kind of language. Each one means something. And so all their movements follow a pattern, become a kind of ritual, bowing, wing stretching, head lifting, pointing their beaks to the sky, or interlocking their beaks in this fascinating scissoring display. You can tell that these two birds are a mated pair on the nest. They have been through this ritual of courtship for many, many weeks, ending up in this attractive mutual preening of each other's neck feathers. There. Their young are not very attractive, especially when they're small, and until they grow the fluffy white down which they keep for several weeks. Now they feed by putting their heads right down into the gullet of their parents and taking food in the form of pre-digested fish from the crop, like this. The gannet catches his food by plunging into the sea from a height, but by contrast the puffin dives from the surface to catch sand eels or small fish, and carries them back to his young, which he feeds in a burrow underground. Now, a few years ago, on a spring visit, the boatman was told by a party of visiting scientists that an albatross had been seen sitting on the cliff top, the first time that any albatross had ever landed on British soil. He could hardly believe it, as all the albatrosses nest in the southern hemisphere, south of the equator, many thousands of miles from Scotland. I telephoned him. Yes, it was still there. So the next day I went across to look for it. No albatross, but everyone said it was sure to return about 8 o'clock to its favourite perch above the lighthouse. Well, I waited, but it didn't return. And I went back another day, after it had been seen again regularly. But again we waited at its favourite haunts and drew a blank. On the third visit I went with a Daily Mail reporter, and everywhere there were young gannets, fully grown now, and as black as albatrosses. Several times our hearts missed a beat. And then, on the fourth visit, after searching all day, suddenly, could that be it? After all those false alarms? Yes, this was unmistakably bigger, blacker, and much more majestic than the gannets, with a fantastic, effortless soaring flight on a 7-foot wingspread. Here it was, a stranger from the South Atlantic, amongst its nearest Scottish relatives, the gannets. And yet, not looking lost, but rather quite at home. And this was a reward well worth all the waiting and searching. It was a very dark bird, and quite obviously used to people by now, as it landed quite close to us, and we could see at once that its beak was quite different from the gannet's spear-pointed beak, having quite a hook on the end, typical of the albatross family. Last century, in about 1830, a black-browed albatross, the same as this bird, and you can see the little black eye stripes that gives it its name, came to the Faroe Islands in the far north, and was called by the local fishermen the King of the Gannets. It must have been a wanderer like this bird, lost miles from home. But the interesting thing was that it stayed on the Faroe Islands for 32 years, until finally it was shot, and it's now in the Copenhagen Museum. So we had high hopes that this bird, too, might return to the Firth of Forth for many years. In the event, it returned only for the next 2, its visit soon becoming shorter and less regular. For lack of another albatross, this bird chose an unmated gannet. And here it's doing a display, clattering its bill and spreading its tail and going through the same sort of courtship ritual that the gannets do to each other. Albatrosses on their home colonies in the South Atlantic go through these displays all through the early days of spring. We watched it lunging at a passing gannet, as though it was for a brief spell defending a territory on Scottish soil. But the chances, of course, of it finding a mate and ever breeding here are very remote. Well, it was getting late. We couldn't tear ourselves away. See how easily this huge bird lifts off on those marvellous glider-shaped wings. The boatman was getting impatient. And we couldn't stay too long, but we stayed as long as we dared, feasting our eyes on the wonderful flight pattern of one of the rarest birds ever to visit Scottish waters. You know, albatrosses in their travels are able to keep aloft using only the uplift from the swell over the tracts of ocean for hundreds and hundreds of miles. So there's always the possibility that another one will cross the equator and reach the northern hemisphere. In fact, every year 1 or 2 sightings are made of various species of albatross in British waters, but usually of this one, the black-browed albatross. A visit to the Bass Rock, you know, is always worthwhile, but this had been a unique visit, a day to remember. It's nice to dream that perhaps one day another albatross will find its way north, this time bringing a mate with it, and perhaps they'll settle down to breed as the king and queen of the gannets.